For those days, it's probably about 25 miles an hour, but he certainly frightened Joe and his wife to death. So this was the result of Sir John's tree planting. This is all that's left of it, the rhododendrons, but that is his the bridge that he built across the Shedden Brook, and that's the long straight bit that ran up to Shedden farmhouse, which was here. And that was the sort of beauty that he created. He definitely created a very beautiful area of mystery. You could wander around amongst the trees. You were trespassing, of course, and had to avoid the gamekeepers, but it was an area of great beauty despite its nearness to Burnley soot, and so that was the kind of countryside that he created in the Shedden Valley. Way up in the Shedden Valley on these slopes were those rectangular plantations. Anticipating the story, these were chopped down in the 1950s, but there was one plantation here that was so inaccessible that they just left it to die off. But and it was dying off, it was in a pathetic state, and then with the introduction of the smokeless zones, it revitalised, and now it's a magnificent little plantation on the moor with the trees revitalised and growing in health. This was Shedden Farm. This was the last tenant at Shedden Farm, a retired policeman, and there was the farmhouse and the farm cottage, and of course the barn. That was the farm that it had a meadow in front of it. I don't know whether you noticed on that first map. In front of the farm there was an area that wasn't planted with trees, and that meadow had pheasant rearing pens all the way around it, netted over pheasant rearing pens, and that was the job of the gamekeepers who lived here at Shedden Farm. That is Stipperden Bar, where Joe Collins lived, and his wife. This was what the Long Causeway used to be like when it was just a narrow road going by. And that is the semi-gentleman's residence that Sir John built for Mr. Cole. Originally there was a usual long farmhouse, very much like the Sportsman's Arms. It had a house and a barn attached to it, and being at the top of the hill, it also had a smithy, and it was called the Tup. And of course, by the time the wagoners in the horse-drawn days had got to the top here, both the horse and the wagoners were ready for a drink, and often the horse or the wagon needed the attention of the blacksmith. But Sir John raised that to the ground and built this house for his gamekeeper, head gamekeeper. I approached the heirs of the Thursby family to see if they'd any family albums with photographs, and I was only able to get two showing this activity and here they are on the leaning against the parapet of that bridge over the Shedden stream. And this is Sir John, the tall, very tall man, and that is the shooting party, probably waiting for the beaters to put up the birds. Now, Sir John died in 1921, and all his estate had to be left to the next male heir, and he only had two daughters, so the estate was left to his younger brother. And his younger brother lived down in Hampshire and had no interest whatsoever in the Burnley area. So the entire Thursby estates in the Burnley area were put up for sale by auction, and this was lot 9, a valuable sporting and agricultural estate, 1,344, and the moorlands, excellent mixed shooting and providing capital grazing for sheep and cattle. So that was put up by auction at the Bull Hotel, Burnley, in September 1922. But there were no takers. That was where the first post-war depression was just setting in 1922, and there was nobody prepared to come forward and buy this as a sporting estate or for farming. So it was unsold at the estate, but it was later bought by Burnley Corporation Water Department as water gathering grounds. So the second phase of the Shedden Valley was this shooting, Sir John Thursby's shooting estate. The third phase now set in, and that was one of dereliction to a certain extent, because all the Burnley Corporation wanted was to keep people away from the water gathering grounds for they just built Hurstwood Reservoir. That was opened in 1922. Of course, Cantclough Reservoir had been there since the 1890s, but they wanted the whole of this area kept free of a human population in the interests of purity of the water. There was always a great fear of cholera and typhoid in those days. So that was the nightmare of the water departments, a cholera epidemic, and they went to great lengths to keep people away. So we now come to the phase of Cantclough and Hurstwood reservoirs. This is Cantclough Reservoir on the Shedden, with the Shedden Valley running down in front of it. So the work they did, apart from the non-work in letting everything fall down, they enclosed the Shedden Brook into this lodge here, which when I went up there to live at first, the farmers around always called it the Wreck Lodge, and I couldn't understand what this meant, a wreck lodge, but there it was the Wreck Lodge. And the Shedden stream ran into the Wreck Lodge. And then they took a great 5-foot diameter iron pipe from here straight across the moor into Cantclough Reservoir, and that was to divert the Shedden stream into the reservoir for Burnley's increasing demand for water. Now you'll notice an area of trees here. That was called the Old Plantation. Sir John's plantation was the new plantation. This was the old plantation and was deciduous trees. All Sir John's trees were coniferous ones. Oh, that's another view. Now, when the last tenant died of Shedden Farm, the water department refused, although there were plenty of applications, refused to let it to another tenant. They left it semi-derelict. Then they said it was a danger because children were playing on it. They sold the slates off the roof, and then they gave, there was a new housing estate in Worsthorne, wanted roads to it, and they gave the builders permission to come and pull it down and use the stone in the foundation of the roads in Worsthorne. So that was the end of Shedden Farm. Then lower down the valley there was all the houses in the little villages of Holmes Chapel and Mereclough, and all had their own water supplies. They'd either had to go to a well with a bucket, or they had a little stream running by, and again with the public health acts it was said that all houses should have a proper clean piped water supply. So the township of Cliviger applied to have its own water supply in the Shedden Valley, and they sank a borehole here, put a wall round it, and then took a pipe way down from there to Mereclough, and then from Mereclough it was distributed down to Home Chapel and down to Walk Mill. Now in those days all they did was just provide one cold water tap in each house. There was still no flush lavatories, no bathrooms, and they were supposed to be, well, they were highly delighted to have one cold water tap rather than have to walk out with a bucket to a well or a stream. So that was another feature in imposed by man upon the Shedden Valley. The location of this is just at the bottom of that drove road. This is Worsthorne Moor unenclosed, this is the Cliviger Moor, and there was a gateway here onto the drove road through the Cliviger enclosures. Now when the water department took over in 1920, about 1925, all Sir John's trees and plantations were in full growth. They'd been planted in the about early years of the 1900s, so they'd acquired a decent height, and the water department took advice on to what to do with these plantations, and the advice was that because of Burnley's pollution, the trees were slowly dying. And the smoke pollution from not only Burnley but Accrington, Great Harwood, Blackburn, all the smoke from those towns on the westerly prevailing wind came right over the top here, and these trees were being poisoned and dying. So they were advised to fell them, because this was after the war, by 1950. Well, after the war, 1946-47, they took this advice, and they were advised to fell them because there was a great shortage of pit props at the time, and it said that they would probably be economically suitable. They would certainly, what they got for pit props would cover the cost of felling them. So the whole of the valley was devastated. Every single tree, coniferous tree that is, was chopped down. And when the trees had gone, this was the nightmare landscape that met my eyes. And that is the mystery of the Shedden Valley. What was it that had caused this nightmare landscape, a sort of moonscape or battlefield? The Ordnance Survey maps put it down as quarries, but they weren't quarries, because a quarry always has a face of rock from which you have cut the stone away with sharp, and then there were piles of reject stone, all with sharp rectangular edges where the rock had been split away on the quarry face. But there was nothing like that there. There was just this sort of landscape. I show one or two views. That's a view of it. Of this, you can see there's no trace of a quarry at all. So there was a mystery here, and I, living at the foot of this mystery, and often having to roam up here looking for stray animals, there was a challenge which I couldn't escape from. I just had to, every time I went up, I was discovering something new and wondering what it was all about. And it gradually crystallised into a number of features that were repeated all the way up the valley. The valley stretched for 2 miles above my farm, and all the way up there were certain features that repeated themselves time and time again, and there were 5 of these features, and the first one, which you must have noticed, are all these piles of stone. Now these are not quarry stone, which I've said always has sharp edges where it's been split off the rock. These were all rounded boulders such as you find in the river beds, and it wasn't just that there were a few of them, there were acres, and also all that you see here is the tip of the iceberg, because nature has done its best to cover it over. And for example, if you stand there, you'd be standing on top of 6 or 7 feet of boulders. And when you think of the mass here, there's not just tons, there's hundreds, possibly thousands of tons of these boulders in the 2-mile run of the valley. Here you see them, and you can see the rounded nature of them. They've all rounded edges. There's an odd couple of conifers of Sir John's that escaped the woodsman's axe. The deciduous trees were not chopped down. And then, of course, Sir John had planted a lot of rhododendrons, as was the habit of the gentry in the early years of the century. I always like a photograph with Pendle Hill on, because you can orientate yourself with Pendle Hill. So that was the sort of landscape that I was roaming on. You see these piles of stone, the hundreds of tons of stone everywhere you go up the valley. So that was one feature, these massive piles of stone everywhere, all sandstone. And then the second feature were these unusual corrugations. You got those, not just 2 or 3 of them, but corrugations everywhere on the side of the valley. If you counted them all up, you get into the hundreds. So it wasn't just a question of seeing a little area like that, which men could have dug out, but there were acres of them. You see them all here, the corrugations everywhere. This is the open moor, and this is the Shedden Valley. You can see the Shedden Brook running through the bottom of it, and of course the stone trash everywhere. And I tried to, this was just an experiment that failed. Here is Middle Pasture Farm where I live, and I was trying to get this area of corrugations along here thrown up by the setting sun, but it wasn't too effective. But you can see there are corrugations all the way along here. Now the next feature that puzzled me was mainly on the moors all round the Shedden Valley were these dry water courses. I stuck these white broom handles on more just to accentuate them, because they were very difficult to photograph. All these features had been left untouched for some 200 to 300 years, so nature had done its best to obliterate them, and they weren't too easy to photograph. But then again, I must accentuate, it wasn't just an odd few yards of water courses, there were literally miles of them. You see that there's a water course here maintained by a great embankment thrown up. And there's one running along here, round there, and another one along here. And there's one here right in the heart of the old plantation, running down through the old plantation. I've marked it off with it's been dug out and a bank thrown up. Now, what were the purpose of all these water courses? At first I thought it was just an attempt to drain the moor, but after studying them, they didn't conform to any system of agricultural drainage. They had nothing whatsoever to do with draining the moor. The next feature were these peculiar humped mounds like the pyramids of Giza, and there again, instead of just 2 or 3,